James's eyes opened slowly after 2 years of complete darkness. His throat was dry, his body weak, but his ears caught every word. "I'll marry him first," Florence whispered, her voice dripping with sweetness. "Then we'll take it all. Once. The company's under my name. James won't even be needed." Romeo chuckled darkly beside her, his hand sliding under her dress, fingers curling around her thigh. 2 years of pretending, Florence. You deserve every penny after this." Florence giggled softly, pressing her lips to Romeo's. Who would have thought he'd survive the accident? But don't worry. I'll make sure he walks down that aisle, even if I have to drug him through the ceremony. James felt his chest tighten. Every word was a blade slicing through his ribs. His fiancée, his business partner, the two people he trusted most. Plotting his destruction while standing right next to his hospital bed. He had handed everything over before his surgery, all the shares, all the property, signing it over to Florence, thinking she would protect his empire if he never woke up. Now, standing over his half-paralyzed body, they were laughing about his survival. Romeo's voice lowered as he stroked Florence's cheek. "Do you think he heard us?" Florence smiled coldly. "Let him hear. What can a half-dead man do?" James closed his eyes again. He needed them to believe he was still unconscious. But deep inside him, something had already snapped. James wasn't born into wealth. Every dollar he owned was carved from his own sweat and blood. From the ground up, he built the Blackstone Corporation, a towering empire that even old money families bowed before. His parents had died when he was 19, leaving him nothing but debt and humiliation. James swore that no one would ever step on him again. For 10 years, he worked like a madman, sacrificing sleep, relationships, even his own health just to build something no one could take away. But then came Florence. She appeared like spring, sunlight in his cold, hollow world, sweet, gentle, beautiful, with soft eyes that looked at him like he wasn't just a machine made to generate money. She was the only woman who treated him like a man instead of a billionaire, or so he thought. They met during a business charity event. Florence was there as a volunteer nurse, taking care of an old retired chairman. James noticed her not because of her beauty. Many women chased him for his wealth, but because she never once asked who he was. She just smiled, helped him with a minor hand injury, and went back to her duties without trying to latch on to his status. That innocence pulled him in. For the first time in years, James let his walls down. Within a few months, they started dating. Florence was everything he thought he'd been missing. Supportive, kind, understanding. She never cared about his busy schedule and never asked him for expensive gifts. She even convinced him to slow down and take care of his health. It was Florence who stood beside him when his body started giving up under the pressure. The overworking, the late nights, the missed meals, they finally caught up to him. His doctor warned him of severe heart complications, but James brushed it off. He couldn't afford weakness, not when enemies circled like sharks. Then came the accident. James was driving home late one stormy night. He had just finalized a billion-dollar merger, his biggest deal yet, when the brakes failed on the highway. The car spun wildly before slamming into the guardrail. By the time paramedics arrived, James was already unconscious, his body broken, his brain damaged. That night changed everything. The world believed James might never wake up. The news spread like wildfire. The mighty CEO had fallen. Countless board members secretly celebrated. Enemies prepared to feast on his empire. But Florence, she cried publicly, promising to stay by his side no matter how long it took. Thibaut. Media loved her for it. The loyal fiancée who refused to abandon her comatose lover. She sold the perfect story. James's attorney, worried about legal loopholes during James's coma, convinced him, before surgery, to temporarily transfer his assets into Florence's name for safekeeping. James had signed without hesitation. Florence was the only one he trusted. The one person he believed would protect his legacy. For 2 years, Florence visited him daily, smiling in front of the cameras, playing the grieving, loyal fiancée. The world praised her kindness, her devotion. She took control of his company, attended board meetings, and acted as the interim CEO, managing everything James once held. But beneath the facade, behind closed doors, a different truth unfolded. Florence wasn't alone. Romeo had entered the picture quietly, like a snake slipping into James's house. Once James's business partner, Romeo had always been envious. He wanted Blackstone Corporation, but more than that, he wanted what James had, Florence. James had trusted Romeo for years. They went to college together, built early deals together. Romeo was there when James struggled, pretending to be a loyal friend while secretly feeding his jealousy. When James entered the coma, Florence and Romeo found each other, or perhaps had already found each other long before the accident. Now, while James lay silent, they grew bolder. Together they schemed, transferring more control of the company to themselves, funneling funds under the radar, and preparing for a wedding that would seal everything permanently. The media had no idea. The world only saw Florence as the perfect woman who nursed her fiancé through tragedy. But James knew better now. That hospital room, where he first opened his eyes and heard their whispered conversation, had shattered every illusion. His Florence, his angel, had been the knife pressed closest to his throat all along. The betrayal was complete. The woman he planned to marry, the woman he wanted to build a family with, had turned him into nothing more than a pawn. And Romeo, his so-called brother-in-arms, had stabbed him deeper than any competitor ever could. Lying on that hospital bed, James kept his eyes closed as they continued their conversation. His body was still weak, but his mind was sharper than ever. He wasn't going to expose them yet. No, he would let them believe he was still helpless. Let them plan their wedding. Let them think they had won. Because when James moved, it would be final and brutal. 3 weeks had passed since James opened his eyes. He pretended to remain weak, barely responsive, allowing Florence to control everything, just as she wanted. Every word, every fake tear she shed by his bedside only fed the fire inside him. Florence arrived at the hospital every day with fresh flowers, designer handbags dangling from her delicate arm, and an innocent smile that could fool the world, but not James anymore. "James, sweetheart," she cooed while adjusting his pillow. "The doctors say you're recovering faster than expected. I'm so happy. Once you're stronger, we'll finally have that wedding we dreamed of." Her voice was sweet, but her eyes flickered with calculation. Romeo often visited too, always with the excuse of business matters. But James noticed how Romeo's hand always brushed Florence's waist a little too long, how their glances carried silent conversations, and how their smiles twisted into something vile when they thought James wasn't looking. "James," Romeo would say, his tone dripping with fake concern. "Don't you worry about Blackstone. Florence and I are handling everything. You just focus on getting better, my friend." Friend. The word made James sick. He knew what they had done. The private conversations they had shared, standing right beside his unconscious body. The soft moans he had heard late one night when Florence had forgotten to check the surveillance camera angles in his room. They thought he was nothing more than a breathing corpse. One afternoon, while Florence stepped out for a board meeting, Romeo stayed behind. He pulled up a chair, sitting close to James's bed, leaning forward with a wicked grin. "James," he whispered, as if sharing a secret with a corpse, "you have no idea how much I owe you." He chuckled under his breath, his voice filled with arrogance. "You built an empire I could never have. You loved a woman who never truly loved you. And now, all of it belongs to me. Florence, the company, everything." Romeo smirked as he stared into James's barely opened eyes. "You'll be my best man at the wedding, you know? Of course you won't be standing, but you'll still be there." The door creaked. Florence returned, carrying a file filled with legal documents. She smiled at Romeo as if nothing had been said. "Everything's ready," she whispered. Once James signs the remaining papers, the final ownership transfer will be complete. The prenup is ironclad. After the wedding, it's all ours. James's breath slowed, pretending to remain unaware. Later that night, as the nurses left and the room dimmed, Florence leaned close to James's ear, her perfume suffocating him. "You've always trusted me," she whispered sweetly. "And you always will." James's fingers twitched under the blanket. His heartbeat remained steady, but inside, he was counting every betrayal, every lie, every moment they had mocked him. He was awake, and when the time came, they would both learn that the man they thought they had buried wasn't dead. He was simply waiting. Every night when the lights dimmed and Florence's footsteps faded down the hallway, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling as if it held all the answers to his shattered world. 2 years. 2 entire years of his life stolen. And now, as his body slowly recovered, piece by piece, he realized that the wound inside him ran deeper than the scars on his skin. The woman he loved had stood beside him, whispered words of loyalty into his ear while slipping into the arms of another man, the same man he once called a brother. He had trusted both of them more than anyone else in this world, and now they were weaving his destruction together like a silk web, smiling sweetly while lay, preparing to choke him. He clenched his fists beneath the blanket so hard that his nails dug into his palm, leaving crescent marks that bled faintly. The pain was dull compared to the burning rage spreading through his chest. What haunted him most wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the thought of why. Had Florence ever loved him? Or was it always about his empire, his money, his name? Had every kiss, every whispered promise, every tear shed by his hospital bed been part of a long, carefully constructed performance? He replayed their memories in his head, their late-night talks, the vacations, the way she used to hold his hand during his surgeries. Had it all been fake? And Romeo, that snake. How long had he coveted what James built? Had he schemed from the start? Was the accident even truly an accident? The thought crawled under James's skin like a swarm of insects, but he couldn't lose control. Every time the nurses checked his vitals, James forced his body into a state of calm. The machines couldn't betray him before he was ready to strike back. His heart would race furiously in his chest, but he would steady his breathing, suppress the flood of rage threatening to drown him. He knew he couldn't fight them with emotion alone. He needed to watch, to listen, to gather every detail of their plan. Every lie they whispered in the dark, every careless slip of the tongue, every transfer of money hidden under Florence's name. All of it would become the evidence he needed. There were moments when the weight of the betrayal almost crushed him. Late at night, he would feel the tears sting his eyes, not from weakness, but from the bitter cocktail of grief and rage that refused to let him sleep. The woman he once imagined spending his life with had offered his heart to another man, while he lay helpless, but James refused to drown in sorrow. He whispered to himself under his breath, barely audible, "Not yet. You haven't won." Florence had underestimated him. So had Romeo. They thought that stripping him of his wealth and leaving him as a fragile shell was enough to destroy him, but they forgot who he was. He hadn't clawed his way out of poverty to become one of the most powerful men in the city. By being weak, he would not be their victim. The hardest part was seeing Florence every morning as she walked in with her perfect smiles. She played the doting fiancé in front of the doctors, feeding him soup, brushing his hair, even wiping his forehead while cameras clicked outside the hospital doors. She controlled the narrative of a loyal woman nursing her beloved back to health, making the world fall in love with her image. Every time her hand touched his skin, he had to resist the urge to recoil in disgust. And yet, James allowed it. He let her feed him lies. He let her think he was still trapped inside the fog of his recovery. Every soft kiss she planted on his forehead became another stone added to the fortress of rage he was building inside himself. Romeo, too, had grown more arrogant with each passing day. The man would sit in James's hospital room, flipping through corporate reports, making backdoor deals in front of his so-called friend. And sometimes, just before leaving, Romeo would lean close and whisper words meant to stab into James's heart. "Don't worry, James," he'd say with a crooked smile. "Florence and I will take care of everything for you." The audacity made James's blood boil, but he forced himself to remain still. For now. In the quiet of his private suffering, James made a vow. He would not simply expose them. He would break them. He would let them climb higher, let them believe they stood on solid ground, and then rip it out from beneath their feet so violently that they would never recover. They thought they had caged him. They hadn't realized they had simply locked themselves inside the same cage and handed him the key. 2 months later, James had recovered enough strength to walk on his own. Of course, to Florence and Romeo, it appeared like a miracle, but to James it was calculated. Every step, every progress report had been carefully controlled. The more he appeared to depend on them, the more reckless they became. Florence planned the wedding aggressively. The date was set, invitations sent, and the media was buzzing with the touching story of the billionaire CEO marrying the woman who stayed by his side for 2 long years. Public sympathy made Florence untouchable. The world adored her devotion, and James allowed it. He let Florence parade him around in public, holding his arm tightly as they posed for cameras. She whispered in his ear, "Soon, everything will finally be perfect." Her smile was wide, but James could see the desperation hidden behind her eyes. She wanted that wedding badly, not because of love, but because of what it secured. Romeo, on the other hand, grew bolder. He handled more of the business, made high-level decisions, and funneled money into shell companies overseas under dummy accounts. James tracked every transaction silently. The turning point came one evening at a private engagement party hosted by Florence's family. All the elite of the city were there. The atmosphere was glamorous. Lavish floral arrangements, soft classical music, champagne flowing like water. James walked alongside Florence, nodding at guests, his face calm and composed, yet every step felt heavier. Tonight, his patience would be tested more than ever. In the far corner of the room stood a familiar figure, Lena. Lena had once worked as James's legal advisor, sharp as a blade, loyal to the core. She had been forced out of Blackstone under pressure when Florence and Romeo gained control, but tonight she returned, not by accident. Their eyes met for a brief second across the ballroom. No words exchanged, but James saw it clearly. She had discovered something. Later that night, Lena approached him quietly while Florence was distracted by reporters. "James," she whispered under her breath, slipping a tiny flash drive into his pocket. "The accident. It wasn't an accident." James's pupils contracted. Lena continued, her voice cold. "I found the mechanic Romeo paid. Your car's brake line was cut deliberately. He planned your death before you even went into a coma." A sharp chill ran down James's spine, though his expression didn't flinch in front of the cameras. 2 years. Not only had Romeo stolen his business and his woman, he had tried to kill him. Lena's voice trembled with rage. "They weren't just waiting for you to die after the accident, James. They caused it." James nodded slightly. His fingers tightened around the champagne glass, but he controlled the boiling storm within. Florence returned, linking her arm with his once more. "Everything okay, darling?" she asked sweetly. James smiled, his voice steady. "Perfect." But inside him, the war had truly begun. Now it wasn't just betrayal, it was attempted murder. The wedding day arrived. Everything was flawless. A grand cathedral reserved for the ceremony, rows of powerful guests dressed in black and white, photographers flashing endlessly, reporters buzzing about Florence's fairy tale devotion. Florence looked breathtaking. A custom-designed white gown, sparkling diamond necklace gifted by James himself before his coma, and the flawless image of a loyal bride who had suffered through 2 years of tragedy. Her face glowed with perfect innocence. James stood at the altar beside her, perfectly calm. Florence's hand gripped his, but behind her veil her eyes kept darting toward Romeo, who stood just a few rows behind the priest, blending with the crowd. The secret plan was simple. The marriage would legally secure James's wealth under Florence's full ownership. After the ceremony, James would sign one final document Romeo had prepared, a trust consolidation agreement, that would quietly transfer complete control of Blackstone Corporation into Florence's hands. After that, James would no longer matter. Florence smiled sweetly as the priest began. "Do you, Florence, take James as your lawfully wedded husband?" Her eyes gleamed. "I do." The priest turned to James. "And do you, James, take Florence as your lawfully wedded wife?" There was a brief silence. The entire church held its breath. Then James spoke, voice cold, sharp, slicing through the room. "I do not." Gasps echoed across the cathedral. Florence's smile froze. Her pupils widened behind the veil. The cameras flashed wildly, the media whispering instantly. The priest stammered, "Sir?" James raised his hand, signaling him to stop. With calm, deliberate movements, he turned to face the stunned audience. "I cannot marry a woman who plotted my death." The entire hall fell dead silent. Murmurs erupted. Florence's lips trembled. "James, what are you saying?" James's gaze sharpened. "You want me to repeat it? You and Romeo conspired to kill me 2 years ago. My accident wasn't an accident." Romeo's face drained of color. James gestured toward the main entrance. At that moment, the cathedral doors opened. Uniformed police officers stepped inside, followed by Lena and a state prosecutor holding thick folders of evidence. Gasps turned to panic. The reporters spun their cameras instantly toward the scene unfolding. The prosecutor spoke loudly. "Miss Florence and Mr. Romeo, you are under investigation for attempted murder, corporate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The prosecutor held up signed confessions from the mechanic who had tampered with James's car. Bank transfer records, wiretaps of Romeo's calls, surveillance footage. Every move they made over the last 2 years, documented and now exposed. Romeo broke into a cold sweat. Wait, this isn't true. You have no proof." Lena stepped forward, her voice like ice. "We have everything, including your bribes to the mechanic, Romeo." Florence's knees buckled. Her entire body trembled as she whispered, in disbelief, "You were awake this whole time?" James's voice lowered, calm but filled with venom. "Since the very first day I opened my eyes, I heard every word you whispered while standing at my bedside, every plan, every lie." Florence's breathing turned ragged. No, James, please, I was scared. I only did it because I thought you'd never wake up. I waited for you, didn't I? I took care of you." Her voice cracked, her carefully constructed image collapsing before the audience. James stared at her like she was nothing more than a stranger. "You cared for me? You poisoned me. You sedated me to prolong my coma while you transferred my assets. You would have buried me alive if you had the chance," Romeo snapped. "Enough. You act like you're a victim, James. You were always destined to fall. You had everything. The company, the wealth, Florence, while I stood in your shadow for years." He pointed furiously. "I just took what you didn't deserve. I built Blackstone with you. I deserved my share." James took a slow step forward, voice turning lethal. "You didn't build anything. You latched onto me like a parasite, waiting for the moment to sink your teeth in." Police officers moved toward them. Romeo lunged wildly toward Florence. "You promised me," Romeo shouted. "You said we'd have everything together. You said once we married him, it would all belong to us." Florence screamed, slapping his arm away. "You fool! If you hadn't pushed for the wedding so soon, we could have gotten away with it. You're the reason we're caught." The two turned on each other like animals as the police restrained them both. Cameras captured every word, broadcasting live, across the entire city. Florence thrashed desperately, sobbing. "James, please, we can fix this. I loved you. James's voice was cold as steel. "No, you loved my money. You loved the empire I built. You never loved me." Tears streaked down Florence's cheeks as she screamed, James, please, give me one more chance. He looked at her for the final time. You had 2 years of chances. The police dragged them both out of the cathedral as the entire crowd watched in stunned horror. The fairy tale wedding had become a public execution of their lies. After the chaos settled, Lena approached James quietly. "It's finally over," she said softly. James stared at the empty aisle, voice quiet. "No, it's only beginning." The media outlets exploded with headlines overnight. Billionaire CEO exposes bride's murder plot at wedding. Shocking betrayal. Fiancé and business partner face prison after 2-year scheme. The entire city watched as Florence and Romeo's world crumbled. Weeks passed. The trial was fast, brutal, and made national headlines. The world watched as Florence and Romeo stood before the judge, no longer wearing designer suits or expensive gowns, but cold prison uniforms. The courtroom was filled with the elite who once fawned over Florence's perfect public image. Now, they whispered in disgust as evidence after evidence was presented. Bank transfers, wiretaps, secret offshore accounts, the mechanic's confession. The security footage from James's hospital room, where Florence whispered her evil plans into Romeo's ear while standing inches from James's helpless body. Florence broke down first. Under the crushing weight of evidence, she fell to her knees in the courtroom, sobbing hysterically. "I was manipulated. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Romeo forced me." But Romeo, filled with rage, laughed bitterly from his side of the courtroom. "Liar! You were the one who suggested the wedding. You were the one who sedated him every night. You wanted him gone as much as I did." Their alliance shattered completely as they ripped into each other like wild animals, each hoping to save themselves by destroying the other. The judge slammed his gavel. The trial was over. Florence was sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Romeo was sentenced to 35 years, receiving additional time for orchestrating the assassination attempt and leading the financial crimes. The media tore apart their once perfect love story, branding them as monsters who betrayed the very man who trusted them most. The public, once fooled by their lies, now stood behind James with overwhelming sympathy. He was no longer just the billionaire CEO. He was the man who had crawled out of hell, survived betrayal, and stood tall while those who tried to destroy him rotted behind bars. As Florence was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her eyes locked on James one last time. Desperation filled her voice. "James, please, I still love you. I never wanted this." James looked down at her, his face calm, completely void of the warmth he once held for her. "You wanted my empire," he whispered coldly. "Now you have your empire. I'm behind bars." Florence's screams echoed through the hallway as she was dragged away. Romeo, broken and defeated, kept his head lowered. He had nothing left to say. Outside the courtroom, Lena stood beside James. "It's over," she said gently. James exhaled slowly. Not yet. With the public support behind him, James returned to Blackstone Corporation. His board of directors, once tempted by Florence and Romeo's promises, now stood silently as James reclaimed full control of his empire. The media covered his every move as he restructured the company, purged every corrupt manager who had once sided with his enemies, and rebuilt Blackstone stronger than it had ever been. Stocks soared. Investors returned with full confidence. The world saw a man who refused to die, who returned stronger from the ashes of betrayal. But James's revenge didn't stop at business. He went after every shell company Romeo had created, buying back each hidden asset one by one. Offshore accounts were frozen, secret funds confiscated. Every dollar they stole, James reclaimed it. Florence's family, once proud and arrogant, collapsed under the scandal. Their reputation destroyed, their businesses bankrupt. They begged for mercy behind closed doors, but James offered none. "You raised her," James said when Florence's father pleaded with him privately. "Now carry the shame." As months passed, James's name became synonymous with resilience and power. The man who lost everything and took it all back. Yet, beneath it all, there was one thing no victory could erase: the wound they left in his heart. One night, as James sat alone in his office staring out at the city skyline, Lena quietly entered, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey. "You did it," she said softly. James accepted the glass, but his eyes remained distant. "I survived," he corrected. "That's not the same." Lena sat across from him. "You lost the wrong people, James, but you also found out who never truly deserved you." James finally looked at her, the icy wall behind his gaze melting just slightly. Lena had stood by him from the beginning. She had no reason to help him, yet she had risked everything to expose the truth. He smiled faintly. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." Lena shook her head. "You owe me nothing. You gave me justice." Silence filled the room for a moment, but it was no longer heavy or painful. It was peaceful. James raised his glass. "To new beginnings." They clinked glasses under the soft glow of the city lights. In prison, Florence sat inside her cell, staring blankly at the concrete wall. Her once flawless skin had paled, her eyes hollow. Every night she saw James in her dreams, the man she once held, the life she destroyed. Her regret gnawed at her soul, but it was too late. Romeo, isolated in his own cell block, had long since lost his mind. The betrayal between them had shattered whatever bond once existed. Now he was left with only his own guilt and the endless silence of his cage. James, however, moved forward. With Lena by his side, Blackstone reached new heights. But more importantly, James found peace, not because the past didn't hurt, but because he refused to let it define him. He wasn't just the man who was betrayed, he was the man who outlived his betrayers. And for the first time in years, as the sun rose over the horizon, James allowed himself to finally breathe, free.